October 12, 1985. 10:47 a.m. Cottage near Dover, Kent. The knock was tentative. 3 times, soft enough that Thomas Davies almost missed it over the sound of the kettle whistling in the kitchen. He set down his newspaper, The Times, folded to the crossword he had been pretending to solve, and walked to the front door, his slippers scuffing against the worn carpet his late wife had chosen 40 years earlier. Through the frosted glass, he could see a shape, someone small, uncertain, waiting. He opened the door to a young woman in her 30s, dark-haired, pale-faced, holding an envelope that looked as though it had been folded and unfolded 100 times. "Mr. Davies?" Her accent was German, not heavy, but unmistakable, the vowels clipped and precise in a way that made his name sound foreign in his own language. "Yes. My name is Anna." She hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the envelope tighter. "Anna Becker. I believe you knew my mother. Greta Becker. She said, before she died, that I should find you. That you would want to know." Thomas stared. The name hit him like a physical blow. Greta Becker, a name he had not spoken aloud in decades, a name that belonged to a woman he had loved in the ruins of 1945 and lost in the chaos of 1946. A woman he had married in a registry office in Hamburg with 2 British soldiers as witnesses and a German translator who chain-smoked through the entire ceremony. A woman who had vanished 3 months later, leaving only a note that said she was sorry, that she could not stay, that he would understand someday. He had never understood. He had searched for 6 months, filed reports with military authorities, written letters to every refugee organization in occupied Germany. And then, eventually, he had stopped searching. He had returned to England, resumed civilian life, and buried the memory of Greta Becker beneath 40 years of routine, a teaching career, a modest pension, a cottage near Dover where he lived alone with photographs he rarely looked at and questions he had learned not to ask. And now her daughter stood on his doorstep, holding an envelope, saying he would want to know. "What?" He stopped, cleared his throat. "What did she want you to tell me?" Anna's eyes filled with tears. "That she never stopped loving you. And that she had a reason for leaving. A reason she could not tell you then. But she wanted you to know before," her voice broke. "Before she died. Last month. In Berlin." Thomas stood in the doorway, his heart pounding, his mind scrambling to process what he was hearing. Greta was dead. Greta had loved him. Greta had kept a secret for 40 years. And now her daughter, their daughter, was standing here, holding an envelope that contained truths he had spent half his life trying to forget. He stepped aside. "Come in." The war had taught him that enemies could become lovers. The peace taught him that love could be lost to silence, buried under shame and circumstance, and resurrected only when the ones who carried the secret could no longer bear its weight. The moment stretched. Anna entered slowly, as if crossing a threshold that separated 2 incompatible worlds. Thomas gestured toward the sitting room, a modest space lined with bookshelves, warmed by an electric fire that hummed quietly in the corner. She sat on the edge of the sofa, still clutching the envelope, while Thomas lowered himself into his chair and tried to remember how to breathe. "Tell me," he said finally. "Everything." Anna nodded. She opened the envelope carefully, as if it contained something fragile, and pulled out a letter, pages of thin paper covered in handwriting Thomas recognized immediately. Greta's handwriting. Slanted, precise, the letters formed with the discipline of someone who had been taught penmanship in German schools before the war made such things irrelevant. "She wrote this 3 weeks before she died," Anna said quietly. "She was in hospital. Cancer. She knew she did not have long. And she told me, she made me promise, that I would find you and give you this. She said you deserved to know the truth, even if it came too late." Thomas took the letter with hands that shook. He unfolded it slowly, his vision blurring as he saw the opening line, "My dearest Thomas. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have met our daughter. Our daughter." The room tilted. Thomas gripped the arm of his chair, forcing himself to focus, to read, to understand. The letter was long, pages and pages of explanation, apology, and confession. Greta had been pregnant when she left him in 1946. She had known for weeks but had not told him because she was terrified of what it would mean to raise a half-British, half-German child in a country that despised both, terrified that he would be forced to choose between his duty and his love, terrified that staying would destroy them both. So she had left. She had returned to her family in Berlin, given birth to Anna in secrecy, and spent 40 years raising a daughter alone, never marrying, never telling anyone the full truth. She had told Anna only pieces, that her father was British, that he had been kind, that circumstances had made it impossible for them to stay together. And then, in her final weeks, she had told Anna everything and made her promise to find him. "I know I robbed you of a daughter," Greta wrote. "I know I made a choice that was mine alone to make, and that you paid the price for it. I do not ask for forgiveness. I ask only that you believe me when I say I thought I was protecting you. That I thought leaving was the kindest thing I could do. I was wrong. But I cannot undo what I did. I can only give you this, the truth, and the daughter I should have given you 40 years ago." Thomas read the letter twice. Then he set it down, covered his face with his hands, and wept. If this moment already changed how you see the war, subscribe, the next will surprise you even more. Thomas Davies had been a signals officer attached to the British Army of the Rhine in 1945. 28 years old, trained in radio communications and intelligence coordination, he had spent the final year of the war managing communications networks for units advancing through Germany. His posting took him to Hamburg in June 1945, assigned to the occupation administration, tasked with coordinating logistics and infrastructure in a city that had been bombed into rubble. Hamburg was chaos. 1 million displaced persons, destroyed buildings, no functioning utilities, civilians scavenging for food in the ruins. Thomas worked 16-hour days coordinating supply deliveries, managing refugee camps, and trying to impose order on a population that had lost everything. It was brutal, exhausting work. But it was also necessary. And in the midst of the wreckage, he met Greta. She was working as a translator for the British military government, a German civilian hired to bridge the language gap between occupiers and occupied. 24 years old, thin from malnutrition, her eyes carrying the exhaustion of someone who had survived the war but not yet learned to believe in peace. She translated requisition orders, mediated disputes, and processed paperwork with the same quiet efficiency Thomas applied to his own work. They met in an office that smelled of mildew and cigarette smoke, surrounded by filing cabinets and typewriters that jammed every third keystroke. Thomas needed a translator to explain housing regulations to a group of refugees. Greta translated with mechanical precision, her voice flat, her expression neutral. When the refugees left, Thomas thanked her. She nodded and returned to her desk. The next day, he asked her to translate again. And the day after that. And slowly, incrementally, their interactions shifted from procedural to personal. He learned that she had been a school teacher before the war, that her family home had been destroyed in the firestorm of 1943, that her parents were dead and her brother missing. She learned that he was from Kent, that he had studied history at university, that he planned to return to teaching once his service ended. They began taking lunch together, modest meals of British rations shared in a park that had once been beautiful and now consisted of scorched trees and overgrown pathways. They spoke about books, about cities they had known before the war, about the strangeness of rebuilding a world that felt irretrievably broken. And somewhere in those conversations, something shifted. Not love at first sight, neither of them had room for such luxuries. But recognition. The slow, tentative understanding that they had both survived something terrible and might, together, survive what came after. The relationship was controversial. British soldiers were officially discouraged from fraternizing with German civilians, a policy rooted in the desire to maintain distance between occupiers and occupied, to prevent the kind of personal entanglements that complicated military authority. But the policy was unevenly enforced, and by late 1945, thousands of British soldiers had formed relationships with German women, drawn together by proximity, loneliness, and the strange intimacy of shared devastation. Thomas did not hide his relationship with Greta. He introduced her to his colleagues, ate with her in public, walked with her through the ruins without shame. Some officers disapproved. Some made comments, snide remarks about consorting with the enemy, about compromising British dignity, about the risks of trusting Germans. Thomas ignored them. He had spent the war following orders. He would not let orders dictate whom he loved. In December 1945, he proposed. Not with a ring, there were no jewelry shops left in Hamburg, and military pay did not stretch to such luxuries. He proposed with words, sitting on a bench in the ruined park, watching snow fall on ash. "When I go back to England," he said, "I want you to come with me. As my wife." Greta stared at him, her face pale, her breath visible in the cold. "You cannot mean that." "I do. Your family will hate me. Your country will hate me. I am German. The enemy. You were never my enemy." She was silent for a long time. Then she said, "Yes." They married in January 1946, in a registry office that operated out of a requisition department building. The ceremony was brief, procedural, conducted in English and German with a translator who seemed bored by the entire affair. Thomas wore his uniform. Greta wore a borrowed dress, too large for her frame, cinched at the waist with a belt. 2 British soldiers served as witnesses. There was no reception, no celebration, no family. Just paperwork, signatures, and a promise that felt both fragile and absolute. Thomas wrote to his parents in Kent, informing them of the marriage. They did not reply. The months that followed were the happiest of Thomas's life. He and Greta lived in a small apartment requisitioned for British personnel, a 2-room flat with a functioning stove and running water, luxuries in a city where most civilians had neither. Greta continued working as a translator. Thomas continued coordinating logistics. They lived quietly, carefully, aware that their happiness existed in a fragile bubble that the outside world barely tolerated. In the evenings, they read together. Books salvaged from ruined libraries, donated by aid organizations, borrowed from other soldiers. Greta taught Thomas German. Thomas taught Greta to cook British meals with rations and improvisation. They talked about the future, about returning to England, about building a life beyond the occupation, about the possibility that love could survive the transition from war to peace. Greta wrote in a diary Thomas never saw, "I am happy. It is such a strange feeling that I barely recognize it." 4 years, happiness was forbidden, first by the regime, then by the war, then by the defeat. But Thomas makes me believe that happiness is possible. That I deserve it. That we both do. I am terrified of losing this. I am terrified that the world will not let us keep it. In March 1946, Thomas received orders. His unit was being rotated back to England. Personnel with dependents, including German spouses, would be processed separately, with wives following once immigration paperwork was completed. The timeline was vague, weeks, possibly months, depending on bureaucratic efficiency and political will. Thomas would leave in April. Greta would follow as soon as authorization came through. They spent March preparing. Thomas filed the necessary paperwork, secured affidavits attesting to the legitimacy of their marriage, submitted applications for Greta's entry visa. Greta gathered what few possessions she owned, clothing, photographs, her diary. They talked about England, about the cottage they would rent, about the life they would build once she arrived. Thomas promised to write every week. Greta promised to be patient. He left on April 14, 1946. They said goodbye on a train platform, surrounded by other soldiers and their tearful farewells. Thomas kissed her, held her, whispered promises he fully intended to keep. Greta smiled, though her eyes were wet, and told him she would see him soon. He never saw her again. The letters came for 6 weeks. Greta's handwriting on thin paper, postmarked Hamburg, describing her days, her impatience, her hope that the paperwork would arrive soon. Then, in late May, the letters stopped. Thomas wrote to her apartment. No reply. He wrote to the military government office where she worked. They informed him she had resigned without explanation. He wrote to refugee organizations, to the Red Cross, to every authority he could think of. No one had seen her. No one knew where she had gone. In July, a letter arrived. Not from Greta, from a German woman Thomas did not know, a neighbor who had lived in the same building. The letter was brief, apologetic, and devastating. Greta had left Hamburg in early June. She had packed her belongings, paid her rent, and told the neighbor she was returning to her family in Berlin. She had left no forwarding address. She had said only that she could not go to England, that it had been a mistake, that she was sorry. Thomas read the letter a dozen times, trying to extract meaning from the sparse words, trying to understand what had changed, what he had done wrong, why she had left without explanation. He considered traveling to Berlin, but the Soviet sector was increasingly closed, travel was restricted, and he had no way to locate her even if he reached the city. He filed reports with authorities, begged for assistance, and was told there was nothing they could do. Greta had left voluntarily. She was a German citizen in Soviet-controlled territory. The British had no jurisdiction. By 1947, Thomas had stopped searching. He returned to teaching, rented a cottage in Kent, and tried to rebuild a life that felt like a hollow imitation of what he had imagined. He never married again. He told no one about Greta, not his colleagues, not his students, not his family. She became a memory he carried in silence, a wound that never quite healed, a question without an answer. Anna sat on the sofa, watching him cry, her own tears falling quietly. When Thomas finally lowered his hands, she said, "She loved you. Until the end. She told me so." Thomas's voice was hoarse. Why didn't she tell me? Why didn't she? He stopped, unable to finish. Why didn't she trust me? Why didn't she give me the choice? Anna reached into her bag and pulled out a photograph, black and white, creased from years of handling. It showed a young woman holding a baby, standing in front of a building that looked like post-war Berlin. Rubble, reconstruction, the grim functionality of occupation. The woman was Greta. The baby was Anna. She said she was protecting you, Anna said quietly. That if you knew about me, you would have come to Berlin. And that would have destroyed your career, your life, everything. She said the British did not look kindly on soldiers who had children with German women. That you would have been dishing it. She said leaving was the only way to let you have a future. Thomas stared at the photograph. She robbed me of that future. She robbed me of you. I know. She knew. She regretted it every day. But she also believed, until the very end, that she made the right choice. That protecting you was worth the cost. Thomas set the photograph down. He looked at Anna, really looked at her, seeing Greta in the shape of her face, the set of her jaw, the color of her eyes. Seeing himself in the arch of her brow, the line of her nose, the way she held herself with careful reserve. She was his daughter. 40 years old. A stranger. And the only thing he had left of the woman he had loved. Tell me about her, he said. Tell me everything. If you're seeing this war in a new light, subscribe, the next scene will challenge you even more. Anna spoke for hours. She told Thomas about Greta's life in Berlin, about the small apartment in the Soviet sector where they had lived, about Greta's work as a teacher in a state school, about the careful balance Greta had maintained between survival and integrity in a system that demanded both. She told him about her own childhood, about growing up knowing her father was British but never knowing his name, about the shame Greta carried for raising a child alone, about the questions Anna had learned not to ask because asking brought only sadness. Greta had never remarried. She had focused entirely on Anna, on providing education, stability, and love in a country that had been divided and occupied and slowly rebuilt from ashes. She had taught Anna English, told her stories about the war and the occupation, and impressed upon her the importance of education, integrity, and the refusal to hate people simply because they had once been enemies. She never spoke bitterly about you, Anna said. She told me you were kind. That you had treated her with respect when no one else did. That you had given her hope when she thought hope was impossible. She said leaving you was the hardest thing she ever did. But she also said, Anna's voice broke. She said she would do it again. Because she believed it saved you. Thomas listened, his heart breaking and healing simultaneously, trying to reconcile the woman Anna described with the woman he had known for 9 months in Hamburg. They were the same person. But they had lived different lives, his defined by loss and silence, hers by sacrifice and secrecy. And now, 40 years later, the silence was breaking, and the sacrifice was being named. Anna stayed for 3 days. She and Thomas talked for hours, filling in the gaps, constructing a shared history from fragments and photographs and the letters Greta had written but never sent. Anna brought those letters, dozens of them, written over 4 decades, addressed to Thomas but never mailed. Letters describing Anna's childhood, her schooling, her adulthood. Letters expressing love, regret, and the persistent belief that leaving had been the right choice even when it felt unbearable. Thomas read them all. And when he finished, he understood, not forgiveness exactly, but comprehension. Greta had been 24 years old, pregnant, terrified, living in a city controlled by the Soviets and occupied by the British. She had known that revealing the pregnancy would complicate Thomas's life, jeopardize his career, and entangle him in bureaucratic nightmares that might never resolve. She had believed, rightly or wrongly, that leaving was an act of love, a sacrifice that allowed him to have the future she could not share. She had been wrong. But she had also been brave. And the cost of that bravery had been 40 years of separation, a daughter who grew up without a father, and a love that survived only in memory. Before Anna left, she gave Thomas one more thing, a small box wrapped in tissue paper. Inside was a ring, simple gold, worn smooth by decades of wear. Greta's wedding ring. The one Thomas had given her in 1946, improvised from a ring he had bought in a Hamburg market with half a week's pay. She wore it every day, Anna said. Until she went into hospital. She told me to give it to you. She said, Anna smiled through tears. She said it belonged to you. That it always had. Thomas held the ring, feeling its weight, its warmth from Anna's hands, the imprint of 40 years on metal that had circled Greta's finger through a lifetime he had not shared. He slipped it onto his own finger, too small, but it fit on his smallest finger, and felt something settle inside him. Not closure. Not peace. But acknowledgement. The story was not over. It had simply taken 40 years to reach its next chapter. Anna returned to Berlin. Thomas remained in his cottage near Dover. They wrote to each other, letters that crossed borders with the ease 40 years of separation had once denied. Anna visited twice more before Thomas died in 1992, at the age of 75, surrounded by photographs of a woman he had loved and a daughter he had barely known but learned to cherish. In his will, he left everything to Anna: the cottage, his savings, his books, his letters. And a note, handwritten on the day Anna had first knocked on his door. To Anna, "You are proof that love survives even when it seems lost. That silence can be broken. That the war divided us, but you have brought us back together. Your mother was braver than I ever knew. Thank you for finding me. Thank you for giving me the chance to know her again, through you. I am sorry I was not there. But I am grateful, so grateful, that you are here now." If this story has shown you that love can survive decades of silence and separation, subscribe and share it, because the most powerful reunions are the ones that come too late to undo the past but just in time to redeem it. October 12, 1985. 10:47 a.m. A knock on a door in Kent. Soft, tentative, carrying 40 years of silence and a secret that had been buried beneath shame, circumstance, and the belief that sacrifice meant disappearing. Thomas Davies opened the door to his daughter, a stranger who looked like the woman he had loved and lost, holding letters that explained why love had not been enough, why Greta had chosen to leave rather than burden him, why she had carried their daughter alone through decades of rebuilding in a divided city. The war had taught them that enemies could become lovers. The peace taught them that love could be silenced by fear, by duty, by the impossibility of reconciling two worlds that refused to coexist. But it also taught them that love, real love, the kind that survives separation and secrecy and the slow erosion of memory, could be resurrected by a daughter brave enough to carry her mother's truth across borders and deliver it to the man who had never stopped wondering why. Greta had believed that leaving was an act of love. Thomas had believed that love required staying. They were both right. They were both wrong. And the daughter they had created together carried the proof that love was not a single choice but 1,000 small ones, made over a lifetime, by people who did their best with impossible circumstances and learned too late that the greatest tragedy is not loss but the silence that prevents us from understanding it. The knock was soft. The truth was heavy. And the ring, worn smooth by 40 years on Greta's finger, found its way back to Thomas's hand, where it stayed until the day he died, a circle of gold that proved love does not require presence to endure. Only memory. Only the refusal to forget. Only the hope that someday, someone will knock on the door and say, "I have come to tell you what you never knew." The war had taught them fear. The knock taught them that even when love is buried beneath decades of silence, it can still be exhumed, still be named, still be given the ending it deserved, not in reunion, but in recognition. That Greta had loved him. That he had loved her. That their daughter carried both of them forward into a future they never got to share but created nonetheless.